Have you ever wondered what it'd be like if certain inventions were never made? You know, things like the wheel or the airplane? Well, how about something more modern, like electricity? What if electricity had never been discovered? We could probably go on for days talking about just how much of an impact this discovery has had on our lives. It's arguably responsible for some of the biggest changes to our society in the past 100 years. And that's why it's so hard to imagine life without it today. But let's try anyway. Be gone? Nah. Take a look at 5 ways that we would live differently if electricity was never discovered. Number 5. Work and play. The average person spends somewhere around a third of their entire life working, and then a quarter of their life sleeping. So, one of the most noticeable changes in a world without electricity would be people simply working more hours. You see, many jobs today are centered around producing, distributing, or consuming electricity in some way. In fact, there's actually a good chance that your job is one of them. Without electricity, all those jobs would disappear. But that's not even where the problems end. Electricity also allows us to work extended hours into the night. Before electricity, once the sun went down, it was basically impossible to do anything unless it was related to a candle or fire. This meant that people had less time to complete tasks and jobs took longer. For example, think about someone who works in retail. Back in the olden times, they would have likely had to stop working when it got dark out, meaning they'd get fewer hours per week. This would force them to find another job to make up for the lost income. It could be something manual labor related, or maybe another position that required working by candlelight. Either way, if you didn't own a candle, you'd likely be screwed. Without electricity, candles would be the most common light source, but they're expensive and they don't last long. This means that if you're poor and can't afford candles, you might struggle to find a job that pays enough to buy candles, which would mean you'd stay poor. Oh yeah, one more thing. No electricity also means no air conditioning or heating, okay? This alone could change a huge chunk of the population's daily schedules, especially in hotter climates. Working outside during the hottest parts of the day would be impossible, so people would likely work later into the night instead. But they wouldn't be able to work as late because, well, there would be no streetlights. Many people would have to walk home from work, and they couldn't do that safely after dark. All of this would completely change the traditional work schedule that we follow today. Number 4. Food. In today's world, electricity is responsible for nearly every aspect of our food supply chain, from farming to packaging to transportation to cooking. That being said, if you somehow managed to make it to the dinner table without starving to death, your meal would still be quite different. For starters, refrigeration would no longer exist, meaning you couldn't buy pre-packaged foods. Also, you wouldn't be able to buy pre-cut fruit or vegetables. All of that stuff needs to be refrigerated, and it goes bad way too quickly to be left out for display. Instead, you'd have to go to a market where they sold goods fresh. The problem with this is that farmers would need to sell their produce locally, since they wouldn't be able to transport it across country anymore. This means that if you lived far away from a farm, your options would become extremely limited. For example, farmers in California wouldn't be able to ship their avocados to New York anymore. The same goes for everything else. No more Doritos or cereal for you. Also, restaurants would need to cook all their food fresh. No more microwaving stuff or using those big industrial ovens that can cook thousands of meals per day. This would mean that restaurant prices would drop dramatically, assuming they stayed in business at all. With no electricity, most people would probably just eat at home, but that also comes with its own set of challenges. Cooking without electricity would be incredibly difficult. Forget about having an electric or gas stove. You'd need to use a wood-burning stove, which isn't easy to come by these days. And you'd need a constant supply of firewood, which would be pretty hard to come by in a world full of high-rise buildings. Okay. Now, if you did manage to get a hold of a wood-burning stove, you'd still need pots and pans. Okay? And even then, you'd only be able to cook very simple meals. No electricity also means no modern kitchen appliances, so you wouldn't have a microwave oven, toaster, or coffee maker. You would have to boil water over a fire and hope for the best. All in all, food production and distribution would be so disrupted without electricity that there would likely be a lot more hunger in the world. No. 3. Travel. When most people think about travel, they think about flying. They're wrong. Flying is really only a viable option for long distance. Traveling shorter distances by car, train, or bus is definitely more popular. However, both of these forms of transport rely heavily on electricity. If electricity was never invented, air travel would likely still exist, but it would be extremely limited. Airplanes would have to be powered by something else, like gasoline engines. And if you've ever ridden in an old car that runs on pure gasoline, you know that they aren't exactly efficient. But it gets worse. Trains and most public transit systems rely heavily on electricity. In fact, many of them don't even have the capability of running on gasoline. So trains would either need to be replaced by horse-drawn carriages, or they would become obsolete altogether. On the bright side, this would mean no traffic jams. But that's kind of offset by the fact that roads would be extremely dangerous. Cars could still run on gasoline, but with no streetlights, no traffic signals, or any sort of road maintenance, driving at night would be close to impossible. So if you did decide to drive, you'd have to do it during the day, which means you'd need to take time off work. Also, there would be no GPS, which would make navigation significantly more difficult. There would be no Google Maps or Apple Maps, but there would still be Rand McNally maps. Okay, cool. All in all, traveling without electricity would be slow, dangerous, and inconvenient. Number 2, healthcare. Today, doctors use all sorts of electrical equipment to diagnose patients and treat illnesses. Without electricity, many of these tools would be useless. For example, Mr. Rees, ultrasounds, X-rays, and EEGs would all be impossible. Doctors would have to rely on things like stethoscopes and their eyeballs to figure out what was wrong with people. Of course, there are other tools that would still be useful, like scalpels, bandages, and antiseptics. But even those things would be used differently. For example, doctors typically use powered equipment to assist with surgery. Without electricity, surgeons would have to do everything manually, which would put a lot more strain on their hands and arms. It would also take a lot longer to perform surgery, not to mention the increased risk of human error. Basically, without electricity, medicine would go back several hundred years. Vaccines would likely cease to exist, meaning diseases like polio and measles would start to make a comeback. And as you can probably guess, this would lead to a lot more deaths. Not to mention the fact that without electricity, there would be no ambulances or helicopters to transport patients to hospitals. No. 1. Technology. This one should be pretty obvious. Without electricity, we wouldn't have any electronics. This means no smartphones, computers, televisions, or gaming consoles. But it goes beyond just our everyday electronics. Electricity is also essential to many modern conveniences. Think about your house, for example. Without electricity, houses would need to be built differently. There would be no electrical outlets, so you'd need to replace all your lamps with candles or oil lamps. Your fridge would need to be replaced with a root cellar or icebox, and your heating and cooling system would need to be replaced with something like a wood-burning stove. Also, none of your appliances would work, which means no washing machine or dishwasher. You'd have to wash all your clothes by hand and clean all your dishes by hand. And that's just inside your house. Outside, your yard would be full of non-electric appliances like lawnmowers and weed whackers. Even more basic things like clocks and watches would look and function very differently. Most of the technology that we use every day relies in some way on electricity. Without it, we would essentially be living in the 1800s. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave us a like.